unpromised legislation.
No, Count Corley, it's Christmas.
I know, please.
I want to be nice, but he's not being nice or fair.
Well, this is the order of business. Promised legislation. What is it?
Unpromised legislation, Can Corla.
Yeah, please.
I know. I'm trying to.
I'm over time.
I know.
Would you please allow the? I'm trying to be helpful. Otherwise, I'm cutting off. We're over time. So you either cooperate with me now, or we cut it off. Right? Now, Deputy Durkin, no preamble.
Unpromised legislation.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Unpromised legislation. The Companies Miscellaneous Provisions Bill and the Criminal Justice Proceeds of Crime Bill are listed as promised legislation.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
In view of the comments of the Director Outgoing of Corporate Enforcement, both a year ago and more recently in the last week, can I ask the Taoiseach if it is intended to address the weaknesses he referred to in the system which are causing an obstruction or an obstacle to bringing before the courts the people who may have something to answer for? Can I ask the Taoiseach if either of those two bills are likely to be brought before the House as early as possible with that particular purpose in mind?
When are these pieces of legislation?
Yeah, I don't have a definite date for Deputy Durkin, Ciancola. I can confirm for him that discussions in respect to the Proceeds of Crime Bill are going on with CAB, but there's a great deal of work to be done on that, and also in regard to the miscellaneous provisions bill.
Deputy McNamara, quickly, thanks.
Just asking when we will have legislation to give courts discretion not to allow banks to repossess family homes when those banks have unreasonably refused offers.
Sorry, what piece of legislation are we referring to?
I'm referring to the promises of legislation in the latest update of the Memorandum of Understanding with the Troika. And I'm wondering if...
No, Deputy, I'll check your bill. What bill is it? What bill is it?
It's paragraph...
no, but the bill. What's the bill?
Paragraph 33 of the Memorandum of Understanding.
Paragraph 33, but what?
Provides that the authorities will introduce legislation remedying the issues identified by case law in the 2009 Land and Conveyancing Reform Act so as to remove unintended constraints on banks to realise the value of loan collateral under certain circumstances. In other words, Count Corley, to repossess family homes.
Yeah. When is the legislation due?
That will actually happen after the insolvency service is set up, arising from the Dunn case, Deputy, and it's to put in place appropriate legislation that will recognise what has always been there in regard to rights for banks when contracts for lending are set out. So it'll be after the personal insolvency service is set up, and it's to provide clarity here to something that has already been in existence.
Deputy Brown, thank you. Sorry, Deputy, we're not having a debate. We're not having a discussion. Deputy Brown, thank you.
Bill, Taoiseach, where's that at the moment? And could I just ask you, secondly, I couldn't hear your answer yesterday with the RERA in relation to Priory Hall. Do you expect Justice Finnegan to report early in the new year? Thanks, Can.
Governance bill has gone through the Shannon, the Deputy, and we're waiting for it to come with it. Yeah, well, pretty packed agenda, as you know. And in regard to Priory Hall, Minister Hogan has been obviously waiting for some developments here. There has been progress in it, Deputy, and I hope that in due course it will be resolved. I really do feel for those people who are out of their homes and their apartments for quite some time now.
Thank you. Deputy Grealish.
Can Carla, I'd like to ask the Taoiseach on proposed and promised legislation in line with a recent directive that was issued by the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform to all post-primary schools that they must buy off one supplier. This directive has also gone to all local authorities. This is causing a lot of hardship, Taoiseach, among small businesses in localities. In Galway alone, 8 jobs are going to be lost over this directive.
Yeah, what legislation?
Under the Consumer and Competition Bill.
Consumer Competition Bill.
Schools, Deputy Grealish?
Yes, yeah, the Minister for Public Expenditure Reform has issued a procurement that all schools, by April 2013, must buy off one supplier. All their stationery supplies. And
there's a pilot scheme going on in regard to savings in schools, where if they procure their requirements of the savings can be. But it wasn't the case with education. Wasn't the case with education of them being mandated to buy off a particular supplier. I might point out that Minister of State Hayes has done a great deal of work on the whole concept of public procurement, where there are potentially very significant savings to be made, and that bill is being progressed.
Thank you. Deputy MacDonald.
Taoiseach, as you know, the survivors of the Magdalen laundries were excluded from institutional redress schemes to date. They've had no apology from the state, no recognition of the abuse visited on them. Can you tell me when we'll see the interdepartmental report on the Magdalen laundries? And can you assure us that early in the new year there will be time set aside in this Dáil for a debate on that report?
Senator McAleese has indicated, Deputy MacDonald, that the report will be available before the end of the year. Clearly, there's just a short period left. Speaking to him some time ago, I think he's confident that that date will actually be able to be met.
Deputy Boyd-Barrett.
Taoiseach, the sale of 1,000 acres of public lands by Cuilche this week, bringing to 40,000 acres of public forest land sold over the last 20 years or so by this company, would indicate that our forest heritage is being sold from under our feet. And I've asked repeatedly, in this context, in the context of your stated commitment to sell off the harvesting rights of Cuilche, when is the forestry bill going to come before this House so that we can have some discussion in the public light about what is happening to our state forestry?
Two things. The government have considered the sale of timber off forestry lands as being one that could be considered as potentially a sale in respect of a state asset, the timber, not the land. The forestry bill was due to come before the House this session. It won't be before this session ends, so it will be early in the next session next year, Deputy Boyd-Barrett.
Thank you. That completes the order of business. Statements on European Council, Brussels. I call on the Taoiseach to make a statement under Standing Order 43. 15 minutes. Thank you.
I'm pleased to brief the House on the outcome of last week's European Council meeting in Brussels on the 13th and the 14th of December. This was, of course, the final Council meeting before Ireland's presidency begins in less than 2 weeks. The meeting focused upon economic policy, but also covered common security and defence, engagement and foreign affairs. I'm happy to report that progress was made on all of these issues, and in particular on economic and monetary union, and in delivering the commitments that were agreed upon by the Council last June. The meeting began on Thursday evening with the normal engagement with the President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz. He made a call on leaders to improve democratic accountability within EU decision-making, and he made the reasonable point that many would struggle to explain the full range of measures deployed in response to the Eurozone crisis to an ordinary person in the street. And as we in Ireland know very well, this is a vitally important question. Issues debated at EU meetings, including at the European Council, are certainly complex, but we do need to factor in the legitimacy that can only come through public engagement and understanding. Improving the perception of the European Union and the Eurozone will be an important aspect of Ireland's presidency and 2013, including through the discussion that will take place at the informal meeting of Ministers for European Affairs that will be held in Dublin, here in Dublin in January. As the House is aware, next year is also the European Union Year of the Citizen. We will engage closely with the European institutions in making this a meaningful exercise. None of us can take electorates for granted. I said last week, when I briefed the House, that progress on banking union, and especially the single supervisor, was of pressing urgency not just for Ireland, but for the euro area as a whole. The breakthrough agreement by EU finance ministers, including Minister Noonan, in the small hours of Thursday morning was therefore particularly welcome. They agreed and set out an ambitious timetable for the next elements of banking union and a framework for the single supervisory mechanism, or the SSM. That agreement provides for a differentiated approach to supervision depending on the size and on the significance of banks concerned. It provides for equal treatment for euro area and non-euro area member states to allow banking union to be attractive to all 27 member states and to protect the single market. Smaller institutions will not automatically come under the direct supervision of the European Central Bank, but the ECB will remain responsible and will be able to step in to supervise these institutions if necessary. The European Council built upon this by setting a deadline for the operational framework for the SSM to be agreed as soon as possible in the first semester of 2013. This process will include giving a definition to what is meant by legacy assets. It was also made completely clear that this process will ultimately allow the European Stability Mechanism to recapitalise banks directly. The specifics remain to be considered, but this is clearly an important development of our consistent position over the course of this year. The deal on a single supervisor means that we can now move on with the next elements of banking union, which include the harmonisation of national recovery and deposit guarantee schemes. For these measures, the European Council confirmed an ambitious timetable, with the Council to agree in March and co-legislators to agree by the end of June. Ensuring these deadlines are met will be a key task for our presidency. It was agreed that after a single supervisor mechanism is in place, the next logical step is the creation of a single resolution mechanism. On this, the Commission has been asked to submit a proposal next year with the aim of it being adopted by the European Parliament before the European Parliament elections in 2014. The mechanism is to be based on contributions by the financial sector, and it will feature effective backstop arrangements. Taxpayers will not carry the cost. It will have the necessary powers to ensure resolution for any bank in participating member states. In keeping with a clear and consistent position, the European Council also agreed that the immediate priority is to complete and to implement the measures that have already been agreed, including the six-pack, the Stability Treaty and the two-pack, alongside adopting the SSM and other related banking legislation. In particular, it called for the Council and the Parliament to ensure that the two-pack is rapidly adopted. Last week's European Council meeting also made important progress on mapping out the way ahead on economic and monetary union. I set out the background to the discussion on this issue in the pre-Council statement of last week, in particular highlighting the blueprint report by the European Commission and President Van Rompuy's report called the Blueprint by the European Commission, and the draft European Council conclusions, which at that stage included a sequence of structural steps for the strengthening of the EMU. The outcome of last week's meeting mainly focuses on the short to medium term and ties in directly to Irish interests and concerns. Now, in his report to the meeting, President Rompuy set out an ambitious programme for developing EMU, which extended beyond the European Parliament elections in 2014. It fuelled, indeed, an important and an interesting discussion on what is one of the most pressing issues facing the European Union. Deepening economic and monetary union is necessary if we are to underpin the euro as a stable and as a credible currency, which the government strongly supports as a vital national and a European interest. However, as I said to the House last week, it was clear to me that there were elements in Van Rompuy's report that required greater explanation and elaboration. These issues were at the heart of what was discussed last week, where my assessment indeed was widely shared, and it was agreed that further work is required in the period ahead before we are in a position to take any concrete decisions on the way forward. This was especially true of the possible creation of agreements of a contractual nature with member states and of solidarity mechanisms for the Eurozone. Following our discussion, therefore, President Van Rompuy will now consider and consult further and will present a time-bound roadmap on the following four issues to the June 2013 European Council. Firstly, coordination of major economic reforms in the member states. Secondly, the social dimension of EMU. Thirdly, the feasibility and the modalities of contracts for competitiveness and growth between governments and EU institutions. And fourthly, solidarity mechanisms to enhance the efforts made by states that enter into these arrangements. On the first of these, coordination of economic reforms, the Commission is to bring forward a proposal in the context of the European semester, building on Article 11 of the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance. Clearly, new steps towards strengthening economic governance need to be accompanied by stronger legitimacy and accountability. I will be pressing to ensure the involvement of European and national parliaments in this matter. We also agreed that to improve governance within the euro area, building on the provisions of the Stability Treaty, the heads of state or governments of the euro area will adopt rules of procedure for Euro Summit meetings in March of next year. So to help shape the ongoing work in the immediate period ahead, the European Council welcomed the annual growth survey recently published by the Commission, which launches the 2013 European semester process. Ensuring that this is handled efficiently and effectively will be a priority for our presidency. The growth survey will now be considered in the various relevant Council formations, with a view to the Council providing its views to the March 2013 meeting of the European Council, which will agree on the guidance to be given to Member States on the preparation of their stability and convergence and their national reform programmes. We also ask the Commission to include an assessment of labour and product market performance in its next annual growth survey, with a view to promoting growth and jobs. Now, the European Council also gave close consideration to completion of the single market, which is a key priority for the Irish presidency. Last week's conclusions call on the Council and the Parliament to conclude the remaining Single Act 1 files as a matter of urgency, in particular those on professional qualifications, public procurement, posting of workers and e-signatures. These are complex issues. It is also called on the Commission to present all the key Single Market 2 proposals by spring of 2013, and for the Council and the Parliament to assign them the highest priority. As Presidency, Ireland will prioritise these single and digital single market actions. The untapped potential of the EU single market has an important contribution to make to delivering jobs and a growth agenda, and we will work very hard to advance this agenda. I can call it the European Council also called for consideration of the Commission's recent youth employment package, including early adoption of the recommendations on the youth guarantee schemes. This is also a priority objective for the Irish presidency. It clearly matters to the young people of Europe, and in particular to young Irish who are unemployed. We will aim to make significant progress with a view to adopting the recommendations at the Employment, Social Policy, Health and Consumer Affairs Council on the 28th of February next. Youth unemployment will also be the main focus of the informal meeting of the EPSCO ministers taking place in Dublin earlier that month. On enlargement, the European Council made good progress and welcomed and endorsed the conclusions as agreed at the General Affairs Council last week. These will shape the enlargement agenda over the 6 months of Ireland's presidency, and it is likely that we will have to consider such issues as granting candidate status to Albania and opening negotiations with Serbia and possibly Macedonia. We welcome the reference to the conclusions to regaining the momentum in the accession negotiations with Turkey, where we would hope to progress over the next 6 months. We also intend to advance the accession negotiations with Iceland and Montenegro, and will oversee consideration of the final monitoring report on Croatia's preparations for accession. In this regard, we look forward to welcoming Croatia as the 28th member of the European Union on the 1st of July next. The European Council adopted conclusions on the Common Security and Defence Policy, which includes Common Security and Defence Policy missions, capabilities and preparations for a discussion on defence issues at the European Council in December of this year. The European Council tasked the High Representative, that's December 2013. The European Council tasked the High Representative and the relevant EU bodies to develop further proposals and actions aimed at strengthening common security and defence policy and improving the availability of civilian and military capabilities, and to report on these initiatives by September 2013. The issues to be covered in the report will include increasing the effectiveness, the visibility and the impact of CSDP, enhancing the development of defence capabilities and strengthening Europe's defence industry. We also discussed the deteriorating situation in Syria and the ways in which the European Union can try to end the current violence and hasten the emergence of a negotiated solution. The Council reiterated very strongly its view that only a political solution can end the current nightmare for the Syrian people. It also restated that Assad has no place in a new democratic Syria where human rights and the rights of all minorities should be both protected and promoted. The Council considered the outcome of the most recent meeting of the Friends of Syria, which took place in Marrakesh on the 12th of December, where Ireland was represented by Minister of State Costello. The Marrakesh meetings allowed many participants to meet with the leadership of the new Syrian opposition coalition, and Minister Costello extended an invitation to the chairperson of the coalition to meet with the Taoiseach in order to further develop our contacts with the new body and to explore how Ireland and the EU can best be of support. The issue of recognition of the Syrian opposition coalition was also addressed at the Council. Ireland, Ceann Comhairle, remains firmly of the view, in line with a clear majority of EU partners, that it would be premature at this stage to go beyond the limited recognition afforded to the Syrian Opposition Council at the 10th of December Foreign Affairs Council meeting. Our view is that it has still some work to do in terms of building up structures and satisfying us that it is fully representative, inclusive and democratic. This view was ultimately reflected in the conclusions which were agreed at the European Council last Friday. Last week's Council outcome was a good and a positive one, both from an Irish and from a European perspective. It represents progress on a number of key issues that will guide our work as presidency in the first half of next year. And I have to say, it was one of the few council meetings that I was at where there was a sense of optimism and indeed a sense of achievement, and that dates and timelines were actually able to be met and fulfilled in the putting together of the agreement for the legal framework for the single supervisory mechanism. I think that was an indication of leaders' refocused views that it's important that when decisions are made that be followed through and be seen to be followed through at Ceann Comhairle. So obviously I look forward to keeping the House updated on the vitally important work that lies in the time ahead.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Micheál Martin.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. No matter how the Taoiseach talks up the outcome of last week's summit, the fact is that no significant step forward was actually delivered. At the end of a fourth year of economic crisis, the leaders of Europe have decided once again to take the path of complacency. Following the decisive action of the ECB in the middle of the year, the leaders have used it as an excuse to water down and delay every significant element of the programme which Europe needs for jobs and for recovery. This summit did not deliver a banking union. It merely agreed to joint supervision of less than 2% of Eurozone banks and kicked down the road other vital reforms. This summit did not deliver measures to reform the deep flaws in the foundations of the euro. It took all ambitious reforms off the table and fudged what is left for at least 2 years. This summit did not deliver any actions to help the over 20 million Europeans who are unemployed. It simply repeated empty phrases. This summit did not do anything to address the increasing disunion between member states. It ignored the issue, so that yesterday the British Prime Minister said, for the first time, that he could imagine his country leaving the European Union. It's a very significant statement and has huge implications for Europe and indeed for this country. Many commentators have concluded that this summit was the moment when the leaders of Europe signalled that they will make no major move until once again an emergency develops. In relation to Ireland's contribution, yet again no attempt was made to speak up on behalf of vital reforms, and the policy remains one of hoping that something turns up. This remains one of the only governments in Europe which has failed to detail its views on the specific actions required to secure recovery in Europe. From the first time this Dáil discussed European matters after the general election, I and my party have taken a very consistent and constructive line. We believe that a reformed Europe is a vital foundation for sustainable growth and job creation. We reject the empty rhetoric of those who attack Europe as a conspiracy or as an all-powerful dictator. In fact, we have argued that Europe has been too timid. It has tried to tackle an unprecedented crisis with minor incremental changes, always seeking to do as little as possible rather than everything that is required. I remain the only party leader in this House to set out in detail specific proposals capable of addressing the worst flaws in the euro and allowing the European Union to take the lead in helping countries like Ireland to tackle unemployment. We were the first party to demand that we protect the democratic legitimacy of Ireland's relationship with the European Union by having a referendum on the fiscal treaty, and demanding such a referendum. At our Ardèche and in the referendum, Fianna Fáil absolutely refused to take the opportunistic route and campaigned on the basis of the treaty being just the first of many required steps. No one can question that we've been constructive and that we've put the long-term national interest ahead of short-term politics. I'm sorry to say that it's becoming more and more obvious that this government has not developed and is not interested in developing a real strategy on Europe. Everything it does appears to be based on maximising the credit which can be claimed rather than pursuing a clear set of goals. What has happened in recent weeks is that tensions within government and fear of the people have started to impact on European matters, particularly the core issue of banking-related debt. Since the budget, there has been an almost frantic effort by the government, and especially Labour ministers, to show that there is something happening buried deep beneath the broken promises, falling growth targets and rising disillusionment. Both Minister Rabbitte and the Taoiseach have decided that pretending that Labour is the saviour of the nation on the promissory note is the only route to redemption. This has even gone as far as to prompt Minister Noonan to lose his temper at Cabinet and to tell a colleague to butt out of things which are not his concern. On Monday, the Taoiseach broke 3 decades of precedent when he told the Irish media that he would be using the presidency of the Council to secure one of Ireland's main demands. He said this in spite of the facts that he has not attended a single negotiating meeting with the European Central Bank and that the European Central Bank is not subject to decisions of the European Council. A budget has been pushed through the Dail, which has rightly been condemned by most of the public and some government backbenchers because of its entirely avoidable targeting of the most vulnerable in society. What has been less commented upon is the fact that the budget figures are highly unlikely to be achieved. The budget figures can only be achieved if major unspecified savings are imposed by a range of ministers. And as we saw this year, claims about an iron hand guiding spending were completely untrue, and nothing has been changed to make sure that next year is better. Yesterday it was announced that GNP, which is the most important measure of national income in this country, is falling. This is due directly to the major damage done to domestic confidence by government decisions. Other than trying to follow fiscal targets set out in October 2010, there is no strategy to tackle any problem which has grown in the last 2 years. Domestic confidence simply cannot recover as long as the government puts all of its effort into talking about recovery rather than actually taking concrete steps to achieve it. The mortgage and household debt crisis has been allowed to keep growing with no credible response. Investment plans have been published which actually cut investment, with all proposals for funding a job-creating stimulus rejected. It is highly unlikely that figures announced in the budget will be achieved. No major initiative is underway to deliver the spending commitments, and the tax plans will not deliver the claimed revenue. And this is especially true of the family home tax. No, I wasn't. There was $1 billion supplementary estimate. There was $1 billion of a supplementary estimate rushed through the Dáil without debate. So I'm entirely correct. So all that is left is the hope that Europe will again turn up with something which will make up for the failures in budget planning. As I said before, I believe that there will be a deal in relation to the promissory note. The justice of the Irish case demands an outcome which would lengthen the term and reduce the rate to have the impact of repayments on the Irish deficit across a few decades. The case for Ireland has been repeatedly hampered by the refusal of the government to put aside domestic politics. However, the Taoiseach summed up our case well in Paris this October. He has not repeated this line since, so perhaps it was an accidental slip on his part. Certainly it was an unusually non-partisan point for him to make. And he said then, and I quote, "Ireland was the first and only country which had a European position imposed upon it in the sense that there wasn't the opportunity, if the government so wished, to do it their way by burning bondholders," unquote. Any deal which replicates the handling of the repayment made in January this year would be deeply unfair and cause serious economic damage. While the Taoiseach and Minister Rabbitte appear to believe we didn't pay the promissory note in March, we did pay it, and we received a thank you note from the European Central Bank. And the national debt continued to reflect the full value of the promissory notes, but the interest paid out of current funding increased very, very significantly as a result of that particular deal. Millions and millions extra incurred as a result. So this muddling through will have to end, and it should end in the next 3 months. Yet so far the government has refused to publish even a single sheet of paper setting out what it is actually seeking or asking for. No one has been shown any technical papers, no details have been supplied. All we know is that whatever happens, the claims of ministers cannot be taken on face value. As the Taoiseach is aware, since the rotating presidency of the Council was created 40 years ago, it has been the absolute principle that the holder of the presidency does not promote their unique national concerns. This presidency is significantly less influential than in the past because the Taoiseach will not be leading the Council. However, the principle remains. Ireland is lucky to have an excellent group of diplomats working on European issues in Brussels, Dublin and throughout our network of embassies. They are ably assisted by public servants from departments which carry a heavy load of European Union-related work. I have no doubt that they will ensure that the presidency is carried out to their normal and incredibly high standards of professionalism and effectiveness. It does not help, Taoiseach, when members of government try to grandstand at home, looking to impress people with sabre-rattling about using the presidency to secure Ireland's goal. Minister Crichton was right when she said that Ireland being asked to chair the OSCE was a mark of the high esteem European countries hold for us. Of course, this happened over a year before the current government took up office, something never acknowledged in the growing party politicisation of this area by the government. In fact, I was Minister for Foreign Affairs when we were approached with a view to taking the chair of the OSCE, not just by European countries, but by many across the globe. The Taoiseach should instruct his ministers to stop the empty grandstanding in our media. It has already caused us problems with the German government talking about Dublin consistently over spinning deals. The summit deal in relation to the banking union is a major concern. The banking union has always had 3 fundamental elements to it: a single supervisory mechanism, a common system of guaranteeing deposits, and a common system for closing down failed banks. All that has been agreed so far is an incomplete supervisory mechanism, the operation of which is yet to be decided. Under the deal, the new supervisory system will only include extremely large banks. Fewer than 2% of the Eurozone's banks will be covered. Some leaders have pointed out that the new supervisor can step in when banks get into trouble. An amazing point, given the fact that the entire point of supervision is to stop the trouble in the first place. It also misses the fact that, as we know all too well from the Anglo-Irish case, it is small or rapidly growing banks which nearly always cause the trouble. The 30 billion assets limit will become a target to be worked around by creative financial management, and it is a foolish capitulation of the idea which was supposed to have been agreed in June. The resolution and deposit guarantee issues have been kicked down the road as a result of this summit, and there is no sign whatsoever of a growing consensus. As one commentator pointed out on Sunday, the decision to exclude 98% of banks from direct supervision may have already scuppered the other elements of the banking union. And as he wrote, and I quote, "If there are hardly any German banks in the new system, why should one expect Berlin to take part in a resolution system?" Unquote. Europe's leaders left the summit patting themselves on the back for what they had agreed, and we've heard more of the same from the Taoiseach, but in reality, they may have fatally undermined a vital element to restoring Europe's financial system. If it were not for Mario Draghi, there is no doubt 2012 would have turned out to be the most destructive year in the Union's history. He intervened to stop a potential economic meltdown. By stretching the ECB's remit to its very limit and facing down fundamentalist opponents, he did the citizens of Europe a great service. There is more he should have done, but his work in 2012 deserves our particular praise. In contrast, the political leaders of Europe have actually used his work to step back from taking urgent decisions. Even though an imminent collapse was avoided, so too were major steps avoided. This summit postponed every single major reform proposal for the future of economic and monetary union. 12 months ago, we were supposed to be committed to urgent, time-bound and radical action. As of last Friday, all radical actions have been removed from the agenda. There is no urgency. An agreement is targeted for some indefinite time after the formation of the next Commission in late 2014. This is not the leadership which the people of Europe deserve. And I know it's a strong description, but it is a clear betrayal of the spirit which built the European Union and earned it the right to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And the leaders who attended to receive that award should be less than happy with themselves and should reflect on their behaviour over the last 2 years. They have presided over a collapse in public confidence in the European Union. They have engaged in selfish agendas. They have shown no ambition or ability to show consistent leadership. 2013 must not be allowed to see a repetition of this. We need a determined effort to both fully tackle urgent economic issues and to put in place a real framework for sustainable growth. A first start for this should be all leaders being open and honest by setting out their own proposals, by ending the practice, which is now out of control with our government, of caring only about the public relations strategy. And finally, in relation to the foreign affairs agenda, I did ask last week in advance of the summit that the Taoiseach would raise the issue of the Israeli settlement policy as recently articulated, with a major expansion of settlements, and that the Council should condemn that particular behaviour and actions. And I'm disappointed there was no reference today in terms of the Taoiseach's speech in relation to that particular issue. And it is a very serious issue, a provocative act that could put back further the delay of a peaceful two-state solution. Overall, Taoiseach, I would argue that this was a complacent summit, which may, in time, have actually caused considerable long-term damage to the prospects of the Union. Thank you very much.
Deputy, I now call upon Deputy Jury Adams, and I understand you're sharing with Deputy Sean Crowe.
Yeah, Taoiseach, as you know, Sinn Féin profoundly disagrees with your government's attitude to the EU and your failure, as we see it, to stand up for Irish interests. Sinn Féin wants to see a European Union of equals, a social union embedded in citizens' rights, as opposed to a two-tier EU with the larger states in the ascendancy and the government here acquiescing to this. However, having said that, on the cusp of you taking up presidency, let me wish you well next year. I'm sure you see this as an honour, so Nurianta, Latsa, August Lipsha, or Leshan Upper Shin. Well, another summit has come and gone, and it repeated the pattern of previous summits of broken commitments and pledges, a bit like Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and Labour. And Taoiseach, you know, it's very, very clear that the crisis in the EU keeps getting kicked down the road as the governments fail to agree on the best way forward. And last week's summit, which followed on the failure of the member states to agree a new 7-year budget in November, was supposed to see substantive progress on reforming the EU or the euro regime and the banking system. And President Van Rompuy's roadmap ran into a roadblock, and he was sent off with a could do better report card. Now, his roadmap is supposed to set out the way forward for the reduction of national fiscal and economic sovereignty in the interests of deep economic and monetary union. Now, you'll know that Sinn Féin is opposed to an EU fiscal union, and claims at last week's summit by some that the worst is behind us quickly came undone when the German Chancellor rubbished that view. Angela Merkel claimed that the EU faces at least another 2 bad years, which will involve high levels of unemployment and slow growth. It's also clear that the German government, which faces an election in September, has put German interests first. So should we be surprised that the government is still no closer to that elusive deal on Ireland's bank debt that you claimed you had achieved in June? And as this process is strung out, Ireland's debt is heading for more than 120% of GDP, which is totally unsustainable. At the same time, despite all the conflicting bluster from government ministers, there's still no sign of a deal on the promissory note or the long-awaited technical paper. Now, I think a deal will be cobbled together, but it'll just be again pushing this up the road. The notion that we won't pay this is a figment of Pat Roberts' imagination. Taoiseach, last week's European Council summit agreed to the establishment of a single supervisory mechanism and a single resolution mechanism for European banks. And Sinn Féin does support the strongest possible regulation of banks and banking, both at domestic and at European level. The light touch regulation of the Fianna Fáil government was clearly one of the major contributory factors of the banking crisis and the meltdown in the Irish economy. However, Sinn Féin does have serious concerns about giving more power to an unelected and unaccountable body like the ECB. It contributed to the crisis through its low interest rate policy, which flooded Irish banks with cheap money and cheap credit. And the ECB pushed this state into a bailout back in 2010. It also appears to be one of the main obstacles standing in the way of a deal on our debt. And commentators have been rightly critical of the failure of the Irish banking regulators in failing to properly regulate the banking sector. But can we have any confidence that the ECB is fit for purpose before these institutions are given increased powers? Just because regulation failed in this state doesn't necessarily mean the answer is to hand over regulation to the ECB. It hasn't shown itself to have any special insight when it comes to running itself or contributing to the banking debate. So they appear to want all of the rights, but none of the responsibilities when it comes to the banks. They centralise control and supervision over banks, some of which have been nationalised, but refuse to provide a backstop for the euro or to centrally capitalise the banks. And Sinn Féin has called for the ECB to be a lender of the last resort for the euro currency. However, that's not what is on offer. So Taoiseach, focusing solely on problems associated with monetary reform of the euro won't solve the crisis. Bank debt must be written down, and a growth strategy for the EU must be pursued. In this context, I want to make a few short remarks on our forthcoming presidency of the Council of the EU. The Taoiseach last Monday outlined your priorities for the presidency. He said they would be stability, jobs and growth. Fine words, but we have seen none of this delivered by this government after 20 months in office. The 6-month presidency offers an opportunity for this state to show leadership at a European level. It's an opportunity to move away from austerity towards a more socially inclusive EU. It's an opportunity to heal the disastrous social consequences of the austerity policies pursued by this and other EU governments. Now, a lot of important decisions will have to be made during your watch, including the signing off on the EU's 7-year budget or the multi-annual financial framework. The government should be arguing for a budget that will create jobs, retain jobs and invest in jobs. How can the EU be taken seriously when it talks about stimulus, while at the same time it's looking at cutting or at least not increasing its budget? So you need to argue, Taoiseach, for an alternative approach. This includes a well-funded and fair cap, which prioritises working farmers, and I would urge the government to ensure that under its presidency a new peace programme is secured so that the good work to date of the peace programmes are not squandered. I also want to welcome your commitment to an all-Ireland element to the presidency. I understand officials from your government have liaised with officials from the executive in the north, and this is a good thing. Cooperation with the Northern Executive is particularly important on issues like CAP and the peace programme. Taoiseach, Sinn Féin has consistently argued that the government should take a sterner line in negotiation with our EU colleagues over the issue of debt. We should be frank with them. That means telling them that our debt is not sustainable. In other words, that we cannot pay it, and that we need action to alleviate the burden on our citizens and to give our economy a fighting chance of recovery. In pre-summit statements last week, I asked you to raise the case of Pat Finucane, formally or informally, in light of the publication of the Silva review. I am disappointed that there is no mention of this in your statement today. I also ask you to raise illegal actions by the Israeli government following the welcome ceasefire between them and the Palestinians. I am also disappointed that there is no mention of this in your statement. Gordon Margaret.
Deputy Sean Crowe. Taoiseach, it's good to hear that the Irish presidency will focus on youth unemployment. And I suppose, like everyone else across all parties and none, we want to see this actually acted on and delivered during the 6 months that Ireland holds the actual presidency. We know that some countries across the European Union have introduced measures that have kept youth unemployment at an extremely low level. And I suppose it's obvious that countries like Ireland that have unacceptably high level of youth unemployment need to seriously look at many of these credible and viable initiatives that have and adapt them to our own local needs and conditions. Earlier this month, the EU Commission launched its action plan on youth jobs. And again, we know that young people right across Europe were waiting and hoping that something concrete would emerge, or some new thinking would actually gain traction on in this area. The plan is welcome, but it's weak and crucially it doesn't commit any new funding to tackle youth unemployment as a problem that it needs its own focus. So youth unemployment, I think it's running something like 30% in this state. It's as high as 49%, I think, in Donegal. In Dublin South West, in my own constituency, it's running something like around 40%. In some estates in Tala, it's way above that in relation to it. And I suppose if we could factor in the amount of young people that have actually left the country through a lack of work, the figure would dramatically increase. So, and again, I would suggest that the recent budget, one factor, created another push factor by reducing the time people are eligible for job seekers' benefit. I suppose we all hope that progress can be made on youth unemployment during the next 6 months. But the Commission's weak and vague plan, I don't think there's anyone going to be holding their breath in relation to that. So I have a suggestion, Taoiseach, in relation to this. I don't think there's anything stopping the launch of, for instance, during the presidency, of something like a Young Entrepreneurs Fund coming about during the Irish presidency. I'm just asking that question: would there be any difficulty in launching such a fund, a Young Entrepreneurs Fund, during the presidency? And what I'm suggesting is that it could be funded by the European Investment Bank, and in view of the crisis in youth employment, if that fund is too low, there shouldn't be nothing stopping member states increasing their subscription to the EIB for such a fund. So that's a suggestion, a positive suggestion I'm suggesting here today in relation to that we actually do something concrete during the presidency. And I know what you're saying in relation to you're talking about in terms of some meetings, the EP, SCO minister taking place during the month. During the month of February, and youth unemployment will be the main focus. But I'm suggesting that we actually need to move beyond that, that there needs to be something concrete put in place in relation to it. And again, listen to the Taoiseach, there's common agreement right across Europe that, this is the crisis that's faces. So I'm suggesting that we actually put something in place in relation to that. And I think it could be, there is a view that this is just falling into, on the shoulders of the Irish presidency, that's why we're actually taking this up. I would like to think the opposite, that that we're genuine about moving it forward. The adoption of the funding arrangement can also be looked at in view of the crisis, with the 50-50 requirement being waived to a more realistic 75-25 for youth jobs in disadvantaged communities and regions. The bank recapitalisation can call on something like 700 billion from the European Stability Mechanism, and surely we could come up with some realistic proposal emerging during the presidency for such a project, considering that there's so much common agreement, as I was saying, in relation right across Europe. Another area that you mentioned in your speech is the common security and defence policy. And again, Taoiseach, the conclusions of the European Council Summit make large reference to the European common security and defence policy. It states that in today's changing world, the EU is called upon to assume increased responsibilities in the maintenance of international peace and security and the promotion of its interests. I suppose the question I'm asking is, who is actually calling on the EU in this regard? Should it not read that the EU wants to assume greater international powers to promote its own interests, such as free trade agreements with countries that have an abysmal human rights record, the likes of Colombia that I mentioned prior to going off on the most dangerous place in the world for trade unions. The conclusions also outline that further development of Europe's military capabilities will increase employment and growth. Taoiseach, the future of employment and growth will not come from the future militarisation of the EU. EU countries should be reducing the amount spent on militarisation and wars and investing in disadvantaged communities, and alongside viable stimulus package to create sustainable growth and employment. Where will the products of the further militarisation go, Taoiseach? Israel? Syria? Libya? I think we should be focusing much more on growth and employment plans, on industry that profits, not that profits from death and destruction, and particularly areas around the world that are already underdeveloped and disadvantaged. Paragraph 34 of the conclusions of the summit mentioned that the European Council agrees to increase, enhance and strengthen Europe's common security development policy. It speaks of conflict prevention and crisis, but also of increasing Europe's military technology and research. Taoiseach, is it not reasonable to ask, how does the increased militarisation of the EU ensure conflict prevention? I think it's a fair question to ask. There are only 6 states in the EU who are not members of NATO, so how can the EU speak of its high regard for conflict prevention? Again, you know, but they don't seem to be taken on board that many countries like Ireland are neutral. You just have to look at recent conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and what might happen as more EU NATO countries back the opposition in Syria to see how committed to conflict prevention these states are actually promoting in relation to that region. In fact, the whole European Council conclusion on common security and defence is so full of doublespeak that George Orwell would even find it difficult to get his head around some of the stuff. Again, in relation to Syria, the Council conclusion also talk about the situation in Syria. It states that the European Council tasked the Foreign Council to work on all options to support. It's coming to an end. Okay. Right, maybe I'll ask some questions later on in relation to it, but I'm really concerned in relation to...
You have an opportunity to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Deputy, I now call upon Deputy Stephen Donnelly, and I understand you'll share them with Richard Barrett and Nick Wallace.
That's right. Thank you very much. Taoiseach, I've got 5 minutes. I'd just like to touch on a few different issues. One is the single supervisory mechanism, which obviously came out of the recent meeting. Now, Taoiseach, the logic on the single supervisory mechanism goes as follows, that it will lower the risk because if the ECB is in charge of the banks, we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. Now, this is not necessarily true. It's a very dangerous logic, and I think one you hopefully will be cognizant of during our presidency. The argument goes that if the ECB is in charge, the banks will be well regulated, better regulated than they were in the past. For that to be true, it assumes that the ECB is technically proficient. But the ECB has been technically flawed in its response to the Eurozone crisis, as we know. 2 decisions in particular which have hit Ireland. 1, that no European bank would be allowed fail, and 2, that no senior bondholder would incur any cost of their investment. We all know the results of that for us here in Ireland. And not only is the ECB, I would argue, Taoiseach, act in an economically, technically flawed manner, I would argue that its reaction, particularly in these 2 issues, which have socialised private sector losses, are immoral, certainly as judged by the values of our society, as judged by the values of the European project. So there is something very dangerous potentially happening here, which is an institution which has acted technically incompetently, and I would argue in an immoral way contrary to the values of our society and to the European project, is being put in charge because there is a general acceptance that they know best. So I would just ask you to be very cognizant of that while you're at the helm. They don't necessarily know best. They haven't acted well at all, necessarily. A lot of the people who'll be in there are people who are in the central banks around the Eurozone who haven't acted correctly. And remember, Taoiseach, if the ECB gets it wrong, and inevitably they will get things wrong, that becomes a systemic problem. If you have isolated errors, like in Ireland, in Spain, or whatever, the system can correct itself. But if the ECB gets the regulation wrong, and they are more than capable of getting it spectacularly wrong, that error will apply everywhere in the Eurozone. So I just ask you to be very cognizant of that. The second is around President Schulz's concern about democratic accountability, which he has raised here now several times. I am deeply concerned about this. I've looked in detail at the two-pack, at the six-pack, at the fiscal compact, at all of these bits and pieces. And they're incredibly complicated. We in the Finance Committee struggle every week trying to just get our heads around the implications. As the rules become more and more complex and more numerous, there is an inevitable ceding of democratic control from elected representatives like the members of this House to technocrats. It's something we need to be very, very careful of. And I was particularly concerned at some of President Van Rompuy's recommendations. In particular around, and you mentioned it in your statement, agreements of a contractual nature. Now, my understanding of what he's saying is when you, the nation states, submit your budgets to us, we will, invisible technocrats will look at them against a wide range of economic measures, and then we're going to make suggestions to you to correct your budgets. And what President Van Rompuy seems to be saying is, well, by the way, we don't want them to be suggestions. I believe that President Schulz's concerns about democratic accountability are very, very profound and very serious right now. And finally, Taoiseach, I'd like to talk about the pronote and the perception of Ireland and an opportunity we may have. As you know, I believe the pronote should not be paid. I don't believe it should be restructured unless it's €1 a year for 30 billion years or something. I don't believe it should be restructured. I don't think we should pay it, but I'm not in charge, so that's just my opinion. But I believe that some of the resistance is due to a very clear perception in the Eurozone establishment that we're doing fine, and we can deal with it. Now, Taoiseach, I am impressed by how the international media is reporting you at the moment in coming up to our presidency. It is reporting you as very clearly saying and not letting go of the fact that Ireland needs a very substantial deal on the banking debt. And that is to be commended. My concern about the senior European politicians and technocrats during the presidency is that they'll fly in, they'll stay in the Merrion, they'll be wined and dined in Ivy House or in Dublin Castle. They'll fly out. And the concern is that actually they won't see it. So I would ask you and your team to be creative and think about, are there ways that they can see the food queues at the Capuchin Centre? Are there ways they can see the impact of 435,000 people unemployed, and so forth? And then finally, and my time is up, finally, Taoiseach, I've said it once before, I'd just like to repeat it as you go into these negotiations, is the danger of limited success. There is a danger that we will get a small deal and that you will feel you have to take it and bring this back and say, look, this is success. And it is analogous to the distressed mortgage being put on interest only. I would just urge you to be very clear on the fact that we need a very big deal, and a small deal may be worse to take in the short term than a big deal. Thank you,
Deputy
Chair.
Richard Barrett.
Thanks, Ciara. Look, before I make my main points, Taoiseach, I just feel we should correct the public record in a telling comment by Deputy Martin claiming that Fianna Fáil were the first party to call for a referendum on the fiscal treaty. It's interesting because, first of all, it's not true, but secondly, it isn't true at all. But secondly, it indicates that even Fianna Fáil know, notwithstanding the fact that they've supported all of these referendums, know that there is very serious problems at the heart of the European project, which are affecting people, leading them amazingly even to call for wealth taxes now, which some of us have been calling for a long time. But what it reveals is a growing feeling and awareness among huge numbers of people in this country and across Europe that what really happens at these summits is not a gathering of political leaders to secure the interests of ordinary citizens in Europe or to deal with their concerns, But what happens at these gatherings is the representatives of the political elites across Europe meet to plot how they can protect the interests of the European financial system, the corporate interests and the super wealthy in Europe,